are once again at the very lovely and today very sunny corner of Glenwood and Lunch. We are in the heart of Rogers Park in Chicago. We are at the corner of Glenwood and Lunch. We are up on the stage at the Heartland Cafe, and this is another edition of Live from the Heartland Radio. I am your host, Michael James, for this morning's edition on Saturday, October 4th. And we have a pretty good lineup today. We are actually broadcasting some new technical people here, and we got everything seemingly working well. We're going to feature today Ron Sakolsky. He's the author of Seizing the Airwaves, a free radio handbook. Then we're going to have Jalen Neal of Partners for Rogers Park Community Development. And we're going to have About Face Theater's director Barney Metzger come up along with featured person at their theater, Taylor Mack, who has a one-man show, and then we're also going to have Candian from the 8th Day Center for Justice, and we're going to talk about U.S.-Columbia Fair Trade, as it's called. Okay, let's get going. Good morning to you, Ron Sakolsky. Ron, you know, you have a reputation that precedes you. You've been around a while. You work in pirate radio, and now you're up in Canada doing that, but you spent a good number of years, as I understand, down there in Springfield, Illinois, doing pirate radio with another famed pirate radioer. How about giving us a little background on that?
Yeah, well, in the late 80s, stations started up in Springfield out of housing projects, started up out of Chicago, and I was working with him. I did a show there and helped get the original set up, and he's still going strong. And the FCC has come and stolen his transmitter a few times, but he's still on the air. He keeps getting a new one.
Give us and our listeners a little picture, description of what pirate radio is all about. We've had a number of people on the show who have taken low-watt radio down to Central American countries. And, you know, I'm not a techie guy, but I'd like to know how it's done, because the notion of pirate radio really is wrong.
Yeah, I'm not a techie guy either, Michael, but I can tell you a little bit about why people would go low-watt. And low-watt is usually, we're talking about under 50 watts. Sometimes people expand that to under 100 watts. It's unlicensed radio. It's radio that people do because there's a need that's not being met, and decide that they want control over their ability to communicate with one another. So in Obama's case, he basically felt that the mainstream media, or as he called them, the white stream media, were not giving his point of view.
Called the what?
The white stream media.
White stream media.
And so he felt he needed to represent his community. And right now I'm involved in a pirate radio station on a little island in British Columbia called Birmingham. And that's a community kind of grassroots station that people just put together to give themselves a voice.
How many pirate radio stations are there around in North America?
It's hard to say. It could be as many as 200-300. At any given time, the scene shifts and different people are doing stations or moving on to other things.
And what kind of resistance, so to speak, do pirate radio stations get from the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission?
Well, the main resistance is that they're operating without a license. So the FCC will come knocking on your door if there is a complaint. The complaints usually come from commercial radio stations who feel competition or feel that their signal is being impinged upon. It isn't always being impinged upon, but that's usually what they'll claim. They'll make a complaint to the FCC, and the FCC is obligated to investigate. What they do is they knock on your door and tell you to cease and desist. If you continue to broadcast, they can come back and steal your equipment, and if you still continue to broadcast, they can file civil charges against you, but that almost never happens.
We're talking with Ron Sakolsky on Live from the Heartland Radio on 88.7 WWW, Loyola University's community radio station. And Ron is the author of Seizing the Airwaves, a free radio handbook, which he has written along with dunifer. So, are there any celebrated cases of ongoing resistance to the FCC? Are there people who may get shut down and then move on and do it in more guerrilla fashion out of the trunk of a car, moving it around. Give us some, some stories about how this works.
Well, you mentioned Stephen Dunifer, and he's probably one of the most celebrated cases. He began just broadcasting in the Berkeley Hills in California out of his backpack, and he was broadcasting from up high on the hills into the city.
I've been up on the top there, looking out over the bay.
He eventually put together Free Radio Berkeley, and for many years was challenging the FCC and claiming the right to broadcast. He eventually was shut down by the FCC after several years, but he opened up a space for many people to come on when it was still legally sort of a hazy area and people weren't sure whether the FCC could, in fact, shut him down. He was claiming a constitutional right to free speech.
Is it still a hazy area? Is it pretty solidified now as things get a little more conservative or have in the country? Is there some legal question about whether or not people ought to be able to do what we call pirate radio?
Well, I think one of the things that is different now than was the case then is low-power FM licenses are legal to some extent. And there is a LPFM program in existence that the FCC has put together. In my opinion, the reason the FCC put it together was to squelch the pirate radio movement. Essentially, they offered free legal licenses to people who had been part of the movement, and there were a number of those people who were very glad to get them. But there were other people who weren't in it to get a license. They were radio pirates, and that's what they wanted to be, and they wanted to subvert the airwaves in that way.
How difficult is it to get a low-power radio license from the FCC?
Well, if you live in Chicago, it's impossible. And urban areas don't have access to those licenses. And typically the people who get those licenses are either the religious right or established organizations that are organizations with a high public profile of respectability. And the majority of those licenses go to stations like that. There is a group called Prometheus Radio, which tries to promote more stations like the one you're involved with, that are offering a little different perspective. But for the most part, those stations are pretty mainstream.
What do you see as the future of pirate radio? I mean, it would seem to me as I guess I would say as things break down,
Yeah, I've noticed that.
more and more, that there would be incentive for people of various bents. Let's hope there are some progressives involved who would say, we're going to take it to the street, so to speak, or to the hills, or to the alley. Do you see this as a phenomenon that is going to grow, or do you think that the low-power licenses that the FCC has given out will inhibit the rebellious aspect of it?
Yeah, well, the FCC can now claim, if you're a pirate, that you have a legal option. And so they use that to try to squelch people who do pirate radio. But many people, regardless of that, are continuing to go on the air. Let me tell you a little bit about the station that I'm presently involved in on a small island, because islands are interesting laboratories for the future. And basically that station is called Tree Frog Radio. It's a radio station that involves many members of the community who don't typically have a public voice in community debates and discussions. There is, for example, an all-French Quebecois show, otherwise you wouldn't hear French language radio. There are a number of immigrants who find their voice on that radio station. There are renters who have a voice as opposed to property owners. The whole thing is financed and supported by the island. The island, in many ways, even though it was an anarchist project, initiated by anarchists, has thought of it as their community station, and everybody who has the ability to go on is very supportive of it as well. So we find that we can finance ourselves, and our financing costs like $35 a month to pay for electricity. That's our only cost. simply by recycling bottles in a bin that says Tree Frog Radio. We also have self-defense, community self-defense. And that's a term that I use for the fact that there are some ferry workers who have radio shows. And if the CRTC, which is like your FTC, is heading towards the island, they'll let us know and we'll shut down the station. The chief of the fire department, there's a volunteer fire department, they have an emergency kind of setup. If the CRTC is coming to check out their emergency setup, they'll call us up on the phone and say, look, you might want to stay off the air for a while today. So we have a lot of support financially and other ways.
How big an island is the island that Tree Frog is on, and can you tell us that island?
Yeah, I can tell it to you here, I guess. It's not a clandestine station, really, actually. There are 1,000 people on the island. It's about the size of Manhattan Island, but a lot less dense.
Now, are the Canadian community, whatever they're called, what do you see? What are they called? Like the FCC?
The CRTC.
Are they as, we have a notion here, or not a notion, we know that the FCC has been a pretty conservative force in recent years. I know that Canada has had a change in government, moved a little to the right, at least in the Prime Minister.
Sure. Yeah.
But what is how do they compare to the FCC?
They're very much like the FCC. It's a complaint-driven process, and the fact that there have been no complaints and we've been on for 3.5 years shows that we have community support.
We're talking to Ron Sakolsky, the author of Seizing the Airwaves, a free radio handbook. You're listening to WLUW 88.7's Live from the Heartland, where you can hear us every Saturday morning from 9 to 10. And you can also hear a lot of other great community programming as well as music on WLUW, Loyola University's community radio station. Ron, you mentioned kind of anarchists had set up the station, and I just happened to have a copy of Surrealist Subversions, Rants, Writings, and Images by the Surrealist Movement in the United States. And it's edited by you with a foreword by our neighbor, Franklin Rosemont, who just happens to be sitting over there in the dining room here at the Heartland Cafe. And could you tell us a little bit tell us about this book and give us a definition of surrealism and how that relates to anarchism. How's that?
Okay, that's certainly something I'd be pleased to talk about. The last time that I was at the Heartland, which was 6 years ago before I left the States, was for a surrealist event. So I know that the Heartland Cafe has always been a welcoming place for that kind of thing. When I put this book together, it's a pretty comprehensive book. As you know, you're listening it.
It's thick. I'm holding it up for the video camera. Someday maybe you will all see this on the Heartland Internet TV, which is in the works. For more information, you would go to www.heartlandcafe.com. Go, Ron.
Yeah, and basically the book is meant to be a comprehensive volume focusing on the Chicago Surrealist group. So Chicago is at the heart of the book. And the approach that I took had to do with the connections between surrealism and anarchy. Not every piece in the book has those connections immediately up front, but that's the idea that I tried to bring together. So the idea of demanding the impossible, which is an anarchist idea, fits very well with
Commanding
the surreal.
Or demanding?
Demanding. Commanding is your idea.
As the one who studied a little democratic centralism there for a while.
Yeah. So demanding the impossible means you're sort of in favor of expanding the idea of what's possible. And instead of settling for a miserablest kind of reality, to use surrealist terms, you look for an exalted kind of reality that is more in tune with surrealism. So I see the two as very much connected.
I like this notion of miserablesism.
So do I. Yeah, it's a very evocative term, right?
Why don't you give us a succinct definition of surrealism and then one of anarchism, just so I can listen to it and work it into my own repertoire of various raps.
Well, maybe you should get Franklin up here to give us
he's been up here plenty. Another time. You do your best on this one.
Okay, well, if we're talking about surrealism, we're talking about moving beyond the limits of what's usually considered reality. So we're talking about a movement that is desirous of creating a world in which people can live more poetic lives and connecting the idea of the dream and reality so that reality isn't so impoverished and so miserable. If we're talking about anarchy, we're also talking about creating new worlds that are free of domination, free of any form of hierarchy, and exploring the possibilities of what could be rather than of the as is.
We are talking with Ron Sakolsky, and I want to ask you in our closing moments of this section of Live from the Heartland Radio where one would find Seizing the Airwaves, a free radio handbook. Who published it, and how's it distributed? Is it out there in the world in bookstores? Is it on Amazon? Is it?
Yeah, it's published by AK Press.
Oh, AK Press. I've met those people. They're really good. They put out a lot of great material.
They're on the Bay Area, so it's readily available there, as well as other places.
Anarchist Press?
Yes, good old Anarchist Press. And Surrealist Subversions is put out by Otana Media, and actually is also carried by AK Press Distribution.
Ron, do you have any way that people can contact you, a phone number, a website, an email, or do you have any words of wisdom and inspiration to give to all of the listeners for Live from the Heartland?
Yeah, I'll do the words of inspiration. Go on the air. Go on the air. Go on the air.
More radio. More radio. Let me ask you one last thing. How do you see pirate radio? I mean, the thing that I got to say I've been thinking a lot about is doing kind of internet radio and TV. Do you see some kind of a link between those two, a way they would work together?
Well, yeah, there is a way they work together. There are some pirate stations that will stream internet and use that as part of their broadcasts.
Stream the internet.
That.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's have a big round of applause for Ron. And we'll be right back.